we have a guest lecturer today, Professor Annalu from the University of Dundee, and she is the chair in the Communication Technologies Department, Human Communication Technologies, and she will speak today about augmented and alternative communication technologies and individuals that use these. So, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Yes. And yes, just begin.
Good afternoon, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to give a lecture today. You're all spread out. Yeah, so I'll be moving like this so that I can see you all. You can all hear me, can you? Yep, great. Today I'm going to just introduce you to some of the research we do at Dundee, and then look to see whether there's any possibility of interaction and what your interests are. So I'll try and talk for only 45 minutes, but knowing me, I'll have to stop before I finish all that I want to say. So let's begin. And I'm just, as usual, trying to get technology working, because often it doesn't. So what am I concerned about? I'm in the field of assistive technology. I'm a trained rehabilitation engineer, so my role is to look at how technology, low-tech through high-tech, can support better quality of life for individuals with disabilities. And so we can look at mobility, personal and medical care, cognitive support, environmental control, a whole span of issues that we can use, even a straw, to give people the independence that they need for living in society and for making the best possible use of their abilities. However, and this is where my interest comes in, is I believe that without communication, it doesn't matter how much you support somebody unless they're able to interact with other people in a meaningful way. Having mobility, having independence is probably not as good as it can get. So my philosophy is that we need to underpin everything with communication. Unless we get that right, we aren't actually empowering people to be the people they can be. And the reason for that is that communication is the essence of life. It's the most complex skill that we as humans have. It develops from when we're in the womb till we die. And we learn to do more and more sophisticated things by experimenting, by learning as we do. The big problem for me and my colleagues, the big problem is for some people, their physical and learning disabilities restrict that communication. Whether it is because they can't learn and develop language and communication, or whether physically they can't talk, we have a real barrier to interaction. Some of you will recognize Stephen Hawking up there, a very famous user of what we call AAC, augmentative and alternative communication. But he is a terrible example, because no matter what technology you give him, he will work out a way to use it. The majority of people we work with have additional learning disability or language delay, which it restricts their learning of communication skills. So this is the field we work in, augmentative. I am using PowerPoint here to give you an extra support for my disastrous speech. It's augmenting my poor speech. Someone like Stephen Hawking requires an alternative mode of interaction. And we work with everybody, from children who are born disabled, who are growing up, to people who lose their communication because of stroke or degenerative disease or Alzheimer's or whatever. The range is very wide. So what do we mean by AAC in practice? AAC could be a hand gesture or a facial expression that somebody close to the person understands. It could be a piece of paper with symbols or writing or letters on it. It could be, and you can see number 4, somebody, all she has is the ability to look in 8 corners or 8 targets. So by placing a perspex frame between her and her partner, you can actually see where she's looking, and you can interpret what she's trying to say, and therefore you can have communication. I've got an older person in number 5 using photographs and pictures to have a conversation, and 6 and 7 are more high-tech ways of communicating. The problem is that despite all the knowledge we have about communication and AAC and the wonderful technology that exists, I can now look at the computer and it knows where I am looking. So I don't even have to have a perspex frame anymore. Although, in reality, the perspex frame does not break down. And it also increases the human interaction between people. So some recent studies show that despite all our high tech, people actually rely on low-tech systems like pieces of paper and their gestures, and most high-tech devices are abandoned. So there's about a 60-70% abandonment rate of these high-tech systems. Why? There are loads of reasons. From ease of use, we have to do a lot of training to get people to use the machines, and they are not the solution. They are only a tool. So unless people know how to communicate first, giving them a high-tech device often doesn't help. Reliability, technical support, very, very few schools, institutions, places where people live have technical support there. It is not part of the way we support AAC. It should be, but it's not. People don't like the voice, the language, although Stephen Hawking has stayed with his robotic deck-talk voice because that is him. How we deliver these processes, how we deliver support, how we train staff is very, very poorly supported. The communication rate is so slow, and we will get back to that. The best communication works when partners are well trained and they know what to do, and service delivery. Now, for me as a computer scientist, what's important here is how we design and deliver systems. And my field is very linked to human-computer interaction, usability, trying to support better design of technology. So what do I mean by technology and AAC? The most simple is a button that you can record voice. Yes, no, I am happy, I want to do this or do that. Very limited, but very effective. Why? Because it's easy to use. It's simple. It doesn't need a lot of training. Another technology we are seeing more and more when people take photographs of a scene and then save or store language underneath hotspots, so we can touch the touch screen and it will talk for us. Again, easier to use. As soon as we start wanting more access to language, we start having to store language under codes or under buttons. So we get into hyperlinks and get several different pages where we can use categories to store vocabulary under that. But again, we are then giving people word-for-word access or sequences. Semantic compaction is a more logically defined coding system where people can learn code sequences for words and phrases. The problem is with both these systems, the training time and the effort to acquire the skills to remember and use language takes time, effort, and almost takes away the opportunity to do other things, like learning to read and write. So it takes so much effort to learn these machines. All the effort is on the user and not on the technology. And then, if somebody acquires literacy or has literacy like Stephen Hawking, then the world is your oyster and you can access anything you want to say. The problem is that most children growing up using AAC do not acquire literacy. It is a very, very complex skill. So, from my perspective, watching people interact using AAC, they tend to be passive. They don't initiate. They don't give you complex language. And they rely on others to tell their stories. So when they move from one situation to another, somebody else has to take their stories with them. So, physical access compared to our 140 words per minute or higher when we talk, people who use AAC are maybe getting 8 to 10 words per minute. That is not conducive to good conversation. Children using AAC seldom acquire literacy. So that means that we have to give them all the vocabulary they need. They can't just see something and tell you they've seen it unless they have that word in their machine. The complexity of learning to use these machines operationally, so they need to learn how the machine works. They also need to develop the linguistic skills at the same time. And they also need to learn the pragmatic, the social, and the strategic skills to interact. This is a big, big ask. So what happens is that in reality, most people who are working with folk who use the AAC are so excited when they can ask for a drink that they then relax. Because in order to get to the next level, to actually engage in more important social conversation, it is a huge, huge step up. And so most of that social conversation is done with body language, facial expression, or interpreted by somebody else. And then my big thing is there is little or no storytelling. So if somebody has been skiing and wants to tell you about their skiing, they might retrieve the word skiing, but their mother will then take over and tell you the story. And this is a major part of our work in Dundee. So my thing is all about how can we design systems to better support AAC. And this is where we are using both computational linguistics and HCI techniques usability to try and enable language play, more access to vocabulary, storytelling, and issues like that. So what I'm going to do now that you know everything about AAC, I'm going to give you some sense of the projects that we've been working on. So one of the big issues is how can we enable children to learn to read and write when they can't talk? We know that phonological awareness is one of the big factors in acquiring literacy, but you need to be able to play with sound. So we've actually created a very, very simple joystick, and we're now working on an eye gaze alternative to access sound without a visual display. Because as soon as you get into visual displays, you are having to learn a code for that sound. And that is what literacy is about. So we want to come in before that letter to sound linkage. So we've developed the system to give children the ability to access novel words without being able to read and write. This is a little girl with Down syndrome who had a session with my researcher, who went back 4 days later, and the teachers said she would never remember where these things were, let alone how to use it. And this is what happened. This child had actually remembered all 6 sounds that she'd been taught 4 days later. And the study we've done subsequent to that actually showed that Down syndrome children, we think, because it was a really small study, can actually produce sounds more effectively using the phonics stick. In the research, Down syndrome children have very poor phonological awareness, and yet with the joystick they were able to score higher marks on the phonological awareness test. So we're not sure what's happening there, but it's almost as if these children understand the sounds, but when they try and say them, the tester doesn't actually interpret them properly. So that's one issue. We've also had cerebral palsy children create new words for the first time, including, remember, swear words. And this was really exciting, is suddenly to see a 12-year-old suddenly realizing the power of creating his own words, because he could say what he wanted and not what somebody else came up with. This research is still in its infancy, and we're now trying to get a longitudinal study to see whether using something like this will impact on the literacy skills of children who at the moment are not even put onto literacy learning because it's too much work. Jokes. Now, I'm not sure about Norwegian, but in English, when children are between 8 and 10, they do a lot of punning, and they learn that words have different meaning, and they start creating their own jokes, and they are terrible. But it's part of developing language. And our children can't do that. So what we did was we worked with the natural language generation folk, and we created a system that actually generates novel punning jokes. And you start off with, for instance, 2 words that sound the same. We then have a template, and we get synonyms for these words. and you have a joke. What do you call a strange market? A bazaar. Like, the big problem, most of these jokes are rubbish. But we're looking at 8 to 10-year-olds. So we're looking at what is appropriate for them. So, here is a little girl. This is the first time she's used the system. What's happening is she's got a head switch in her headrest. The system is scanning a visual interface, and she's then hitting the switch when it gets to the thing she wants to use. It's going again. So basically what's important there is the interaction. For the first time, this child was controlling the interaction. She was actually setting the pace. She was introducing the information. She was saying more than yes, no. This child still today uses yes, no as her main conversation because it takes too much effort to try and find words with her one switch. And what we also found with this study is that children were exploring new vocabulary because the system was giving them weird words. The same way that regular children come across strange words and use it out of context and therefore learn what those words mean, as opposed to a teacher or a therapist giving the child specific vocabulary. The next project I'd like to talk about is to do with storytelling. Storytelling is more than just regurgitating fact. It's about retelling events which have meaning for you and actually getting a link with the audience. And this often starts with parents scaffolding a child's story. Now, tell Daddy, where did we go today? And the child might say, Granny. And what did we do at Granny's? So you're starting to scaffold the child's skill base to tell stories. So we came up with this idea of looking at going into schools and trying to identify interesting events during a child's day so that they could go home and the computer would actually have the information and the scaffolding to allow the child to share that information. So we used what is called data-to-text technology, where we follow children around and we actually knew who they were talking to, what they were interacting with. We knew where the children were during the day because we could track them around. So there's a lot of security and sort of confidential and ethical issues with this as well. We knew what the children should have been doing, because when they were in a different room or with a different person, we knew that something could have happened that was of interest. We also allowed the teachers to add audio recording to the system, because we knew where kids were, who they were with, but we didn't know why. And then with that information, we could actually generate the language related to that event. So I went to the hall, we had music, you know who was there, and you know what object the child was working with. So what we developed was an interface where we had a maximum of 5 events surrounded around lunchtime. We had utterances for each event, so we could generate the first 2 utterances in that story, and there were 3 voice recordings associated with that. But most importantly, the child could decide not to tell anyone, because I don't want to say I've been to the head teacher again. They can move through the utterances in the story, and they could evaluate each utterance, so they could say whether they liked it or not. So here again, we have our same child that we saw 5 years previously. She's grown up a bit, but she's still using yes, no. And the therapist in this video hated the conversation, because she said she was so worried, because every single time she did something or she asked something, she was then saying, oh, this child can't answer me. And yet, look what happens. So basically, what you see here is the red bits are generated by the computer except for the bits in quotes. And what this meant for the children again, our theory or our focus is how can we give children an experience of telling story, because once they've experienced the power of telling this audience, we can then give them more and more control over what they want to say. But it's all about this learning through experience and how we can add to the very important low-tech systems that do work and do give people more control over their conversation. And of course, as people get older, they need to keep their stories and conversations going increases. We had a very sad case where an adult with severe learning difficulties went into another residential home, and his family put up his favorite painting in his room, and the next day when the family came back, the painting was gone because the staff had decided that it was not age appropriate. What they didn't know is that this young man had been left this painting by his grandmother, because throughout his childhood, when he had visited her, that was the painting he had fixated on. But they didn't know that story, and he couldn't tell them. Oh, sorry. So, I'm once going to skip this. Apologies, my battery power is running out. So what's my dream? What's my vision? The vision is really to start harnessing the power of this technology, which we know we can do, but actually empowering industry and health services, education, social services, really to understand that this computer is about to die because the plug has come out. So, very quickly, by putting the users in the center and actually creating better tech transfer into industry, we're really wanting to get more and more trained software engineers to be in this industry so that we can harness more of this opportunity. And with that, I'm going to say I've gone over slightly, but there's time for questions, and I think this computer is about to stop. Thank you very much. So, questions, or if there's a wee bit of time. Judith. You may take the mic. Oops, there you go.
Thank you, Professor Wilder, for this really interesting talk. I was wondering, do you think that we should be trying to put more into the technology so that less of the burden is on the individual to use the technology and more is on the technological design?
My view most of the current AAC systems put all the effort onto the user. So they've actually got to learn how this machine works. They've got to learn where vocabulary is stored. They've got to learn what these pictures mean. And I think we have a lot more opportunity to support that retrieval or to support that language generation using the knowledge we know about language processing, about HCI, about usability. A little thing. Very few machines have the ability to change the volume of their output. So people can't whisper. I mean, that's a basic usability issue that you would actually pick up if you were working with users in the design of the technology. Oh yes, you can put the voice down, but you've got to go through a very complicated sequence of keystrokes to do that. And these are things that the industry is only beginning to be aware of. And that's just from a usability point of view. It's not even trying to encourage more support in terms of word prediction. When we use literacy-based tools, we can speed things up using word prediction. But even that word prediction is now so far behind the state of the art word prediction. So my Samsung phone predicts language far more effectively than any AAC system does.
I have also a question concerning to what extent does the machines have to adapt to different individuals, or is it a standard?
The whole issue of user profiling is something that we know about in terms of AI in education. Amazon does it all the time. All these systems know about the sorry, I get very upset. We know how to do this. So context-based vocabulary. If you're out at the cinema and you're watching a new film, why can't we download the information about that film automatically so that people can talk about it afterwards? The technology is there, but the industry is sadly so small that it's very difficult for them to go out on a limb and start recreating things. And that's why universities have to play a part in this development. Yes.
Thank you, Annalu. It's interesting to see what you are working with. And one of the very interesting things with it is, I think, that you are working with issues that are extremely complex. And that also means that there are many views on what language are, and how linguistics should be conceived, and also what conversation, communication, and narratives are. Um, and and the problem, I guess, is that you have to make some choices that might be right or wrong. And here, I think there's a big well, there are certain traps, I think, related to technology, that it's easy to do what the technology allows, and therefore also to prefer theories and conceptualizations that fits with the technology. I think this is a thing, an issue that has to be addressed properly. And I can see some of the pitfalls that we could see in early language training that was generated by the Løvaas tradition in autism. And that is, I think, that language is something that it learned outside teaching situations. It's totally out of school, and it's a long time before we come into school. So it's all these kind of settings where nothing is formal, and also that where the reference system is so difficult to establish when it comes to what things means. And I think I want to ask you how you related to building narratives into a type of technology, how will you deal with making it possible for people to lie? To tell stories that are just what stories very often are. They are fictions.
There's so much there. I think number one, to talk about education and the role of language development there, I would like to take AAC and language away from the gateholders and put it in the hands of educationalists so that they start seeing AAC as part of what happens in the classroom, underpinning everything that happens there. So that's another discussion. In terms of technology setting the way, unfortunately many techies, and I do respect techies, but often the technology is created and then people have to actually fit into that, which is what you said. It's only by actually looking at what the reality is that we can develop ways in supporting real conversation. When we did the joke project, the children were actually coming up with things that made very little sense. But instead of discarding those jokes, they actually kept them because of the reaction that they got from the conversation partner. So they were deliberately using the jokes with mistakes in them to interact on a more enjoyable level. Now the same thing with stories. If we can get children to be able to construct events as they do when they're 3, 4, 5, hopefully we can then keep on giving them the ability to create their own variations on things so that they can make mistakes they can lie, they can create fictional stuff. But I think we actually need to give them those skills in order to allow them to do things like that. And technology can do that. We just need to know what we want to enable people to do. I don't know if that answers. Sue, you had your...
Yes. I'll be very quick. Thanks. I just wanted to ask you about iPads, which, as we know, are very controversial within the field of AAC. Nevertheless, just about every family that's abandoned a device has an iPad and they're using it one way and another. And I just wondered whether at Dundee you were doing any research into the use of iPads. Particularly, I suppose I was interested in that with the spyware that you've been using, where people are going and things. Obviously there are ways with that of either proving or exploding some of the myths about what iPads do and don't do. So are you using iPads at Dundee for any research yet?
We are. Okay, we are. We're actually in the midst of a project with people who've had strokes and have aphasia because they desperately want to use these iPads. So we're finding out a lot about what they can do and what they can't do with that population. There's just been a really interesting paper by McNaughton, Janice Light and David, where they were really good at explaining their concerns about the iPads and the fact that this again is a flash in the pan. People, I think, are going to be very eager to use them, but they're copies of what we already have. So the systems we are seeing on the iPads are exactly the same as what we've seen for the last 30 years. And I suspect that people will start abandoning them at the same rate when they actually don't do the conversation, but they do allow people to do things like surf the web, do Facebook, watch videos. And that's, I think, is what you will see people using them for. But yes, we're going to see more coming out of that.
Okay, thank you, Annalu. This was very nice, very interesting. I think we'll conclude the lecture, but we will be able to have a conversation afterwards. I'm just going to stop the video at this point. So thank you very much for coming.